Inherency 1. Recent events have shown that for all intents and purposes, there's been no accountability in place for the police whatsoever. Little a. In Ferguson, Missouri, there was an 18-year-old unarmed black man that was shot and killed, and no indictment was achieved despite 17 eyewitnesses agreeing he was putting his hands up or showing some sign of surrender when he was shot. B. Eric Garner was killed with a chokehold that has been banned by police because of how dangerous it was, yet his killer was not indicted in that case either, despite the fact that it was caught on camera, which leads to the plan. The United States federal government should mandate the creation of an Office of Special Prosecutors under any given state's Attorney General, which will handle all cases involving police-involved fatalities. The United States federal government should mandate the creation of an Office of Special Prosecutors under any given state's Attorney General, which will handle all cases involving police-involved fatalities.
Can you give me tense?
Yeah. Solvency. 1. Would entail the creation of independent prosecutor oversight whose sole job is to investigate unauthorized force. A special prosecutor is appointed by a state attorney general to prosecute a case. A special prosecutor doesn't have political connections, normal prosecutors do, and thus doesn't have the conflict of interest. Prosecutors and police officers in the same jurisdiction are part of the same prosecution team. Their allegiances reflect that. They work together every day, and prosecutors rely on police to make their case. A permanent office for special prosecutors housed in the Attorney General's office could be held accountable for overspending. Cato Institute's National Police Misconduct Reporting has said that there are 127 fatalities associated with excessive force. There's already the perception of action on this now in Congress. Representative Johnson of Georgia introduced the Grand Jury Reform Act. Advantage 1. Police are out of control and they can't do anything in the status quo. Uniqueness. Lack of accountability has ultimately increased militarization and violence by the police force. 1. The institution of police violence are staggering. Little a. In Salt Lake City, Utah, the #1 cause of homicides is police officers acting with violence. Little b. According to Vox, 426 felons, as labeled by the state, were killed by police in 2012, which in itself is misleading, as these deaths are underreported by police officers who also label all the criminals as felons in themselves. 2. This problem is exacerbated by militarization of the police. Little a. In the 1960s to 1970s, there were virtually no SWAT teams, and those that did exist were only brought out for things where force was required, like hostage situations. B. By 2000, upwards of 90% of towns with less than 20,000 people had full SWAT teams. C. Over 60% of SWAT raids in the status quo are for low-level drug possession charges, where they use no-knock raids where they effectively break into the building without declaring any sort of intent that they're police or providing any sort of warning to the inhabitants within. D. SWAT teams do 20,000 no-knock raids yearly. 3. Increased militarization leads to high propensity for violence. Little a. There are stories of people being killed in SWAT raids simply for running out of their room upon hearing someone break into their house or making a quick movement upon seeing that there are people entering with guns or trying to defend themselves against people that they are not even sure are the police. B. This militarization has led to a culture of shoot first to protect the police, and one that views every single person, including you and I, as enemies of the police who ought to be treated with violence. 4. The increase in militarization has coincided with total lack of accountability by the police. Little a. In status quo, the prosecutor who relies on police for ultimately testimony and evidence in all of their cases are the same prosecutors that try police for the crimes that they have been charged with. Little b. This has led to ridiculously low rates of indictment of police officers who have been charged with crimes. Darren Wilson was not indicted, nor the cop that killed Eric Garner. In 2013, out of 150,000 federal cases that went in front of a grand jury, only 11 didn't get an indictment, which ultimately means that it's insane that there wasn't at least an indictment that it was able to bring this case to trial. C. It's because of practices like prosecutorial mistakes in Ferguson, where they do not ask for an indictment, that ultimately simply sets the precedent that police and ultimately the prosecutors are going to form a wall where they don't care. And in fact, in Ferguson, he did not ask for an indictment, but simply presented the evidence that included a witness that the police knew was lying, who wasn't even at the scene, and ultimately was supporting Darren Wilson. Links. The plan creates accountability and checks police violence. 1. The plan removes conception of immunity that the number of cases against police and the indictments that they are going after them will no longer just simply be pushed under the rug and will ultimately increase the fervor with which prosecutors go after them because they won't have to worry about any backlash from the police that they themselves are working with. Little a. This signals to the police force that continued violence is no longer acceptable. Rather than literally no punishment at all, ultimately it will force deep changes within administrations and ultimately a cultural shift in how the police interact with those citizens that they're trying to protect. 2. The plan builds on current but imperfect and insufficient regulation. Little a. Body cameras are being put in place, but even now we see that people have been cleared even when the body cameras showed that there was some sort of misconduct taking place. 3. The plan sends a signal that federal government and the country is serious about changing relations. Little a. Only federal action is able to send a sufficient spotlight message because it shows pushback is from everyone, not just from liberal hippies coming from Seattle. Impacts. Police violence representations are continued and ultimately represent a war against people of color. 1. Individuals are constantly being in danger of killed at any moment with any interaction of police. Little a. Millions of black men in New York City are stopped every day. In any one of these actions, they can be killed for showing anger about being profiled and ultimately pulled aside and not complying with police. 2. This represents an ongoing form of dehumanization that is inherently linked to structural violence. In order for this to happen, blacks have to be labeled as felons and without value by police. This is what is happening in the status quo. This ultimately allows for the justification of extermination without any punishment to the police, and the plan ruptures this as they no longer label these people as criminals and allow prosecutors to really protect what is going on. 3. This logic allows the logic of the labeling the black body as a felon leads to mass incarceration and all these other things that the plan attempts to rupture. Further, we're not defending the institutions that we're talking about. We're talking about working within the legal system to bring some sort of justice in these cases and stop police violence. That only the affirmative can check that.
All right, starting flux. All right. It's going to be one off and then case in order.
Is there a particular number of sheets of paper you'd prefer me to flow your off case on?
It's a critique. So.
Yeah.
So really quick, I just prefer to do it the way you do it. That way does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. I usually flow mine on 5.
Okay.
But actually, you can flow it on 4 because you can probably put the thesis at the bottom of framework.
Okay. I will do it however you tell me to do. So I got 4 sheets and then case.
Yeah. Framework, critical perspective on 1, links,
cool.
impacts.
Great. I'm ready whenever everyone else is.
Awesome.
Ready.
First, you just need the framework. One is that debate is rooted in the ability to make us better actors. This is crucial to our agency, which only allows us to realize change in the real world. You're going to be preferencing the most immediate impacts, and it should come first because these are our methodologies. The proximal impacts are the impacts of how we are affected in this round. These are also the precondition to any discussion of policy implications because without questioning our methodology, there's absolutely no way to look at the outcome of policy making, which means that you always have to look at this first. The second argument is that the plan's impacts are fictional, so it doesn't matter if they are good or bad. What we need to do is focus on the advocacies and look at the way in which we enact this because the advocacies we take in debate can really influence the way that we think in the real world, which means that we we always have to look to the advocacies that we are presenting. The third argument here is that the critique comes first, because its key to methodologies. Little a is that it is critical to engaging in policy frameworks, since it precedes the ability to look at consequentialist impacts. It is always going to be prior. The little b is that the app can have access to their impacts, but first they have to justify their mechanism of solvency. If they cannot justify how they solve for this, then they have no ability to their impacts, because the negative implications of the criticism are going to happen prior. Going on to the critical perspective. The legal system is cemented in power structures that reify themselves, believing that social contracts and interpersonal relations are defined through these legal rigid structures without being able to exist outside the system. The court system attempts to regulate and control the mechanisms of coercion used within it. They use this to rationalize using rationalized and technical language to maintain, justifies the ideology of rigid law. This justifies exclusion. When we put the law at the center, it leads to the pushing out of the periphery, and justifies for the actions of classist and racist methodologies when we think that people who are not at the center are inherently less. Going on to the links. The first link here is that of rights. Their discourse makes the individual passive and a non-actor. Only with the legitimacy of the state can we actually create our rights. You can look to the bottom of their case on their impacts, where they specifically say that we're not going to be having a value if we're not valued by the police, and that we have no value right now because of the way that the legal system is treating us. We say that this is pretty problematic because it destroys intrinsic value to life. Additionally, they say that the only way to realize ourselves is through the legal system, which is making the individual unable to act and pushing them into a passive position. The little a here is that they make these rights not inherent but a social contract through the legal system, which is always going to be problematic when we can see that the legal system is corrupt. You can extend their own warrants about how the legal system is pretty problematic. Second point here. Reliance on courts and constitutions, and federal laws makes a stable meaning of logical engagement. We value the law as the United States coming together and being unified, but this fails to recognize our differences within the United States, which always sends us to assimilate us into one entity and doesn't recognize that there are differences and that people are affected in different ways, and pushes out different experiences for only looking at one different way to do this. The law is a rigid structure that is unadaptive, which means that the stability of it disallows for differences. This justifies abuse and denies flexibility of moral discussion. When we are looking at the courts, it leads to judges and prosecutors being forced to do one specific way, and they can't make the decision that they think is morally proper. Going on to the third link, the app tries to make marginal changes to attempt to resolve a militarized system, and the PMC isolates military equipment like no-knock warrants. It shows the first mentality as reasons for violence, and but assumes a special prosecutor will reassure this. Going on to the last one. Okay. The fourth one is that the app endorses the system and pushes the advocates to the periphery. They construct massive peaceful protests, or they deconstruct massive peaceful protests and movements as being hippies, or as just being hippies from Seattle, denying these activist agency and constructing the system as only an avenue for change. Basically, they say that we can only function within the system. This is the entire mechanism, that individuals can't create change if you don't go through the legal system. The impacts. First here is going to be the colonization of the mind. The law is that the legal system is a totalizing system of ideological subjugation. You can see through their own rhetoric, because we are no longer existing outside of the legal framework. We become nothing but tools of the law and social contracts through it. The little b here is that being unable to view ourselves outside of the system means that we lose intrinsic human value. The little c is that this leads to an ontological suicide and devaluation of the other. When we think that people don't have value outside of the legal system, it justifies the killing off of people and justifies violence. This is the root cause of violence. Going on to the alternative. Reject the affirmative as per the criticism and embrace the ontological trashing of the legal system by voting negative. Alt solvency. The first argument here is that consent of the criticism and deconstruction of the system is the only mechanism for solving logistic discourse. Little a is that this gives us access to individual advocacy and our own ability to deconstruct classified notions of discourse. This deconstruction is the alternative of using the system, opening the boundaries, and basically opening up the system and creating the space to interrogate it. The little b here is that this lists a veil of legalistic rhetoric that denies access to our own individual subjectivity and our relation to rights and discourse. We cannot learn our place or our inherent humanity without constructs of unending criticism, without the ability to criticize. We never figure out the problems and never have the ability to value ourselves. The second argument here is that the neg ballot is key. This is about reharnessing agency, so we must be proactive. Vote neg to perform this activism. Continuing to operate within the system allows for the co-optation of solvency, and for the co-optation of solvency that doesn't actually exist. Going on to their case. First on their solvency, we're going to say that you're never going to be able to solve because there's always going to be a political connection. Special prosecutors are still human, and additionally, we would say that judges are the ones that are actually engaging in corruption when they fail to make the right indictment. Additionally, we say that they are saddled by these laws that force them to go in certain directions, even when they know that this is wrong. You say that there was tons of evidence that proves that this was wrong, which means that the judge should have been able to make the moral distinction. The fact that they were saddled by the law and not able to make a judgment that was congruent with morality means that you're never going to which means that you're never going to be able to actually solve the legal system and do this. Additionally, a turn to solvency, the one is going to be that the movements are solving now, the movements are solving now, and they're continuing to push, and that this is going to be the only way to demilitarize police and send the message that it's truly not okay, and you pacify the movement, because if you actually gain any solvency and special prosecution indicts, then people will start to go home and leave the streets because they think that they are getting what they want. This is absolutely not what we want, because the police create the perception that militarization of violence against people is okay, which is going to justify further violence and re-entrench this. Is essentially turns case that your only impact is war against the other. But if you have no ability to do this and you only re-entrench the conflict or the racial conflict, that means that you don't solve. Going on to advantage one. I just want you to extend across the places where they say that we don't have value because the police doesn't treat us properly. These are these exact links that we were talking about, and the fact that they say only the act can solve back. This is the specific denial of agency that is extremely problematic. Yes?
Turn makes police more likely to hide evidence.
Okay, yeah. In turn, this makes police more likely to hide evidence because the police that are corrupt who are not reporting are only going to try to shuffle this and report even less, because that only leaves a trace of evidence for special prosecutors, which means that you only deny the justice that would happen.
Staring glass.
Yep.
No, I know. That's fine.
I probably wrong, but this was the idea I was going for.
Okay, that's just a
Okay.
sounds good.
Alright, the order is going to be the framework, the critique in the order in which they read it, and then the case debate.
Do like LOC order.
Uh-huh.
Cool.
Alright. Is anyone not ready? First, the framework debate. Our framework for this debate is that you should vote for the method that's most likely to create positive political change. Obviously, our plan does not actually happen. Obviously, it's not something that gets instituted by the Congress. The question is whether or not that us advocating in this plan has positive political effects. First, we argue that role-playing probably has positive political effects because politics is personal. Even if we don't get elected to Congress, that does not mean that we don't interact with political systems every single day. When we elect attorney generals, prosecutors, when we get involved with state or local politics, all of these things have serious ramifications for the way that black bodies are treated, and the way that the criminal justice system operates. So it's not a matter if our plan doesn't actually pass, because our argument is that the type of education that we give through the plan is good, and furthermore, we will defend that our method of utilizing institutions to create positive change is probably a good one, and not mutually exclusive with the negative. Now they say They say that the type of actions we have in debate influence the real world. We will concede that it influences the real world, which means that our method of combating institutions will probably spill over. Now go to their contention about the critical perspective. They argue that contemporary legal structures are cemented in power structures This is our argument. Obviously, the criminal justice system is biased towards powerful elites, which causes racial discrimination. Our argument is that in the status quo, police and prosecutors work on the same prosecutorial team. These people, the police are the prosecutors' friends. They see them on a day-to-day basis. They rely on them to make their cases. There's no way. There's a structural incentive for prosecutors not to prosecute police in the status quo. We change that. We change that and make it so that special prosecutors who have no conflict of interest are able to prosecute police to the fullest. We have a couple of reasons why this is solved that come out of our first speech, which are not responded to. The first is that it creates accountability because police can no longer kill with impunity when they know that there's a possibility that they will go to jail with people that they have already put in jail, which police do not want. So there's a structural incentive for them to stop killing, which is an argument that is being conceded. Obviously, we do not remedy the entire problem of the criminal justice system. The point, however, is we literally save lives. Even if we save 100, 200 lives in a year, that is a massive impact, which they cannot avoid because they have not even identified, they cannot even quantify material impact. The plan stops the killing of black bodies, which is a conceded argument. Second, only we expose that the criminal justice system is flawed. In the status quo, people see Law and Order and shows like that and assume that that justice is always served in these cases by having an office of special prosecutors under the Attorney General. In every state we show that the police are not to be trusted, which breaks faith in the system. Only the plan is able to break the faith in the system by appointing special prosecutors. Now, the next argument is the rights link. We do not use the language of rights in our speech. All of our language is having a contingent political action to stop police violence. We're not trying to create any utopian type of system. Your link is also the status quo because your arguments about labeling are happening right now when black bodies are labeled as felons. Our argument is not that these bodies don't have value because they're labeled as felons. Our argument is that they are not perceived as having value by the police, and that is a problem because it makes them able to be killed. The only way even if we can't remedy that perception, we can remedy the structural reasons why police feel like they can kill black bodies in the status quo. They say that we don't recognize difference. Yes, we do recognize difference. That prosecutors have discretion, which is why they will indict officers who kill black bodies, but they will not indict officers who kill black bodies, but they will indict officers who kill white bodies. Even when they don't kill someone, police can be indicted for even wounding a white person. This is the type of racism that we recognize in the system now. You can't call the plan marginal and saves massive amounts of lives. This also our hippie thing was a joke. In any case, we'll talk about why your type of movements fail on the alternative debate, the impact debate. Your impact framing is a perfect example of whiteness. You see that we can simply step outside of the system. Guess who cannot step outside of the system? Black bodies who are in the ghetto that are constantly being policed. White people can step out of the system and have movements in their neighborhoods because they're not massively policed. However, black bodies do not have the option of doing this, which is why we need to actually take material change to change the structures that allow for their killing in the first place. Now the alternative debate. Our hippie thing was a joke, but it is true that these movements fail because they do not actually address the material structures of power that allow for these types of killing. If your alternative is just an ontological thrashing or a deconstruction, this is just a rhetorical, discursive stance that you are taking against the police, which is already the status quo. Black people have never had any respect for the legal justice system. The problem is that white people are empowered and have prosecutorial discretion over indictments. We stop that. It means that your alternative does not have any uniqueness. Permutation do both. Permutation creates uniqueness for their ontological thrashing because we actually change these things. That's above, and the alt alone is going to be able to fail. The alternative has no mechanism to solve. They say that a deconstruction is going to be able to change anything about the system. Look, we've already had critical legal studies. We have a plethora of books on mass incarceration, the way these things work. Black people already know how this works. We have discussions and debate. The one thing we don't have is an understanding of how the criminal justice system operates. One thing we don't have is an understanding of how racism propagates in a supposedly race-neutral system. The plan completely changes that, and it takes the ontological thrashing and makes it into something material, which is the reason why the perm is going to be able to solve, but the alt alone is not going to be able to solve, which is a net benefit to the permutation. Now, they say that a negative ballot is key off the alternative probably creates just as much real change as our fake plan. There's no reason why the alt is somehow more real world than the plan. Now the case debate. Special prosecutors are going to be able to solve because there's no conflict of interest. If they don't work on the same prosecutorial team as the police, there's been the example is how the FBI routine or the federal prosecutors routinely get indictments on against racist cops. No difference on the state level. Now judges don't. They say that judges are key. However, judges do not even have a place in a big place in the indictments. Although all the power relies on the prosecution because they are able to introduce all the crucial evidence. They are the ones who can overload or someone with charges or decide to not charge them at all, and the juries are also important, but they have not given any warrant for why judges are important. And they say that movements solve now. However, that we get rid of momentum for movements. However, any goal of a successful movement has to eventually include the plan. We are a goal of the movement, so it's ridiculous to say that achieving one of their goals will stop the movement because they are going to achieve them anyway if the movement's successful. The plan, in any case, the plan creates momentum because in the status quo, the system is perceived as monolithic and tractable, as something that regular people cannot actually deal with, something that it will be inevitable. The plan, however, shows that this is not true, that we can change the system, which creates momentum for movements. We don't. They say that police are going to hide evidence. There's no warrant for this. In any case, the special prosecutor, if it has an incentive, will be able to show that and charge police from tampering with evidence.
Okay, so question. So you admit that the breaking down of the system should happen prior to the plan, right? Like you're saying that the goals of the movement will need the plan, but they'll need it later.
What's that?
Like one of your last arguments on case, you're saying that the goals of these movements will need plan later, right?
No.
Movements are key now.
No, my argument there was you were saying if the plan happens, it diffuses momentum.
Yes.
The plan is a goal of any movement. Any movement
Exactly,
needs to deal with these things.
It being a goal means that it is later.
Well,
because you have to have the movement first to create the plan.
It doesn't have to be later. It's like saying we want to. It's ridiculous to say that if someone wants something and then once you give that to them, they're going to. I just don't understand why it would hurt the movement in any way.
Here's going to be the alternative solvency. I then put it on the same sheet of paper.
They do.
And then it'll be the links, the impacts, the framework, the critical perspective. I have them put on the same sheet.
That's fine.
Or like the critical perspective on the factor framework.
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm following you.
Okay. And then the case, which will go solvency and damage.
Cool. So real quick, it's all solvency, links, impacts, framework, critical perspective, solvency, advantage.
Yes.
Yeah. Everybody good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This criticism is about our engagement within the system and the mechanisms by which we derive our agency. The affirmative assumes that rights and the mechanisms through which we derive value can only be attained through a system. However, our value is intrinsic. Our ability to reject the system and work within our own agency is what is necessary not only for the affirmative plan, but is necessary for any form of rejection of violence. This is necessary. This means that the alternative that not only is the criticism going to come first within this debate, but we're also going to be the underlying theme that the work within the system is bad. The system itself is racist and corrupt, and that only trying to make marginal changes within it is going to inevitably fail. On the alternative. The first argument that makes that the movement failed because it doesn't address the internal argumentation. However, you can see, you are making a blanket statement. You looked at the civil rights movement that was able to create a change within the world by changing their relation to the system. That individuals within the movement were rejected the mechanisms by which the state functioned, rejected the mechanisms by which the racist cops attacked them, and were able to create change within the world. Our argumentation that you have to create that change first. You have to change your relation to the system before you try to make change, before you try to make political change. Otherwise, it's only going to recreate the state of oppression that has only led to same problems. They say the trashing is only our trashing is only a rhetorical stance. However, this doesn't engage with the argumentation. We say that the mechanisms through which we retain or re-harness our agency is through criticism. By saying that through the mechanisms of the state, we say the problem that the problems are inherent. That we need to reject that argumentation through constant criticism. That with criticism within the movement necessary to reject this is not just a rhetorical stance. The next argument makes the permutation to do both. We have a couple of responses. First, disadvantage that is still in that. First, you still link it at the end of the First, you still relinking to the criticism because the fact that you are only re-engaged within the system to problematize this petition. Second, is that you are co-opting to our ontological rejection. That the argumentation that at its core the legal system is racist and sexist and corrupt. And that the only individuals who have access to it are rich white people who are able to afford the lawyers that allow them access. Your action of trying to re-engage with the system only co-opts our movement, only co-opts the mechanism criticism that we try to create. The next argument makes that the alternative has no mechanism through argumentation. This is how we're not advocating for a specific mechanism or argumentation that criticism in itself is necessary to re-harness our agency. That we need to derive value from ourselves, not from the cops that perceive us to not have value. This is our argumentation that we are people. We have mechanisms. We have the value within the round that the system tries to say that we don't. The next argument makes that we've already had most on critical legal studies, and the discussions are happening. However, the point of the argument that they're going for is that we don't have discussion of how the system works. However, the first argument is that we understand how the system works and that the system itself is racist and corrupt. You can see the mechanisms through which the law tries to reinforce. They try to reinforce itself not only through the lawyers but also through judges that are hampered by things like laws like mandatory minimums say that you have to rule in a specific way while ignoring your own morality.
It's pretty offensive to say that minorities don't understand how the system works. They understand.
Also, it's probably really offensive to say that minorities don't understand how the system works when there are many individuals who not only read about access to the legal system, but you can look to, especially in prisons, where individuals learn about the law in order to be able to change their relationship to and try to reject it. But additionally, the next argument makes that the alternative is not more real than the affirmative. This is not the argumentation. The argumentation that we, in not only in this round, because we are advocates, we need to reject this. But additionally, that the plans and impacts are fictional. That we need to take a point of activism in order to be able to create change within the world.
Yes.
And
Just extend ourselves.
Extend the solvency to specific argumentation that this allows us to re-access our agency and allows us to lift the veil of legalistic rhetoric that just tries to create things so complicated to the point at which we are never able to engage within the system. Thanks. The first argument makes that they're not using language of rights. However, this is completely antithetical to the argumentation they're giving at the PMC that says that the police are the ones that determine who has value as an indication of why they are only deriving the agency from the state. And that is the problem. Now, when the affirmative is trying to say that we only give rights, we only give agency, we only have activism through the system, it makes it so that it corrupts our own individual agency to the point in which we are not able to act within ourselves. The next argument makes that you have to have political action solved. We respond to this on the alternative page that political action is not necessary, and that criticism is the mechanism through which we can create change within the world. The next argument makes that it links to the status quo and that it's not perceived as having value. First, that we have the unique links not only to the rhetoric of the PMC, the mechanism through which they push individuals to the periphery, but additionally the specific mechanism through which they try to create marginal change to an already corrupt system. Literally the PMC isolates 4 different mechanisms through which the police are militarized and cause violence against each other. Against individuals. Yet they assume that a dude with a lawyer who's already within the system of corruption is going to be able to resolve this. They assume that a mysterious special prosecutor is going to resolve all these harms, but it ignores all the problems and only allows for the system and endorses it. The next argument they make is that they recognize difference because the special prosecutor has discretion. However, this is exactly the problem, that the special prosecutors only function within the same system of oppression, only function within the same state system that's just as corrupt, and they go to the same law schools and they have the same connections to the system in which they are prosecuting. Is an indication to why not only special prosecutors never solved, which is an indication as to why the currency could link towards the affirmative by changing our relation to the system, but it also means that there are limitations here to function. Last argument I want to extend is the specific analysis coming out of PMC that says that all these movements, these social movements, civil rights, and the gathering of thousands of individuals with throwing their hands up saying "Don't shoot," it's just hippies in Seattle. Are you kidding me? Impacts. They say that our impacts are just an example of whiteness in that individual, and that the black body can't step out the system. We have to response first is that individuals can't step outside the system. You can look to the Black Panthers as an example of how individuals enforced not only their own morality within their own communities in order to be able to create individual agency, but additionally how they would reject the systems of oppression. Second is that this is a very paternalistic viewpoint that seems that you coming from a position of privilege is the only one that's able to create change within the system of oppression. Only reinforces the same problems. Our argumentation that we have to create an open space in which we can all criticize the systems that are in the systems of oppression, in order to be able to break down into indicates about this is the best mechanism through which we can resolve this framework. The first argument, the first extent of our argumentation says that debate is not an area of policy, but rather is an area of activism. That we are able to that the only mechanism through which the only thing that actually happens outside this is the methods that we use in order to be able to create advocacy within the real world, which indicates that the best thing you should vote for is the best mechanism through which we can resolve this, which is working outside the system and criticizing it. The first argument they make on the framework is that you should vote for the best methodological change, political change. However, this only reinforces the idea that we can only derive agency from the system is relate to the criticism, but we also probably function within it because the fact that we are the avenue for positive change within the world indicates that the criticism resolves the internal harm to this. Additionally, they say that role playing has positive political effect. However, we already resolved this above. They don't resolve any of this argumentation. Third perspective. What's up?
K comes first.
Additionally, we spend the argumentation that the critique comes first. We've already answered all the critical perspective arguments on the links, which means we probably don't need to resolve any of the other argumentation because it's just cross applications.
All right. So it is going to be overview, and then it's basically going to be the same order in the K. You might want to keep the case around for reference on the link pages. Everyone ready? It's going to be a pretty easy vote for the negative when they concede that the K comes first and there's absolutely no offense coming out of the MG on the critique. Any single risk of solvency is going to be enough reason to pull the trigger on the alternative. Going on to the all-solvency, you can look to the fact that that basically all their arguments are just relinks into the K. They cannot go over the fact that these movements fail because, one, we've already proven that individual activism is the thing that is going to be key. They don't respond to any of our arguments about how agency is the way to go. They only retrench themselves saying that we need the system and that the system is the only way to break down the system when they never respond to the links, which means that the system being corrupt is the system being corrupt is going to be a reason why we can never use the system. And additionally, our argument is that our system is racist and classist and that it pushes minorities out of the system and never allows them to reach this. They don't respond to these arguments, which means that going for the system solves is never going to be a way out for them, and they're not going to be able to go for this. Additionally, they might try to go for the perm, but you're not going to let them extrapolate on this. Their perm is literally perm do both with absolutely no benefits and no disadvantages. The alternative, which means that there is going to be absolutely no unique offense for the perm. Additionally, we have unique disadvantages for the perm, showing that it still leads to the criticism because they're using the system and that this is going to be co-option, which means that they are never going to be able to go for this perm. Just once again, don't allow them to expand on this and create more analysis. There was not enough analysis coming out of the MG on how the perm actually functions, and there was absolutely no benefits to the perm or disadvantages to the alternative, which means that there's only a risk of solvency for the alternative, and you're going to be pulling the trigger right there. Yep.
Also, it's the ask because we have to change our relation to the system.
And they also have the Aff because we have to change our relation to the system. When they concede that activism is key to deconstructing the system, they concede that the alternative has the ability to create movements that will then change the system. There's absolutely no reason why we need the plan in a world where personal activism is the avenue to solve. They don't read any arguments to why personal activism can't do this, which means that you're not going to be allowing that in the PMR, and they're granting the solvency, showing that we have the ability to solve the affirmative, which means that there's no reason for their plan. Yeah. Going on to the links. The only link we need here is that they use the system. They never respond to this. The use of a corrupted system is what is bad, because the corruption is what pushes people out and what re-entrenches the mindset that this system is all-knowing and that you have to use it. Additionally, we both agree that the system is biased and only allows access for people of privilege, which means your mechanism of solvency using this privileged system is always going to be problematic and only create change for people who are in advantaged situations, which inherently pushes out minorities and never allows them the access to the rights that you claim. Additionally, you can extend the specific rhetoric coming out of the bottom of the PMC saying that the legal system is the only way to solve back, and that when police are violent against individuals, they have absolutely no value to life. This assumes that police are the ones who recognize our value and that life isn't intrinsic in itself, which is extremely problematic. Yeah.
Internal link turns the app because the special prosecutors are just bad.
Yeah, and extend that the internal link turn the app because special prosecutors are within the same system, which means that they are just as corrupt as the other prosecutors. They don't answer back that special prosecutors are within the legal system, which means that you still link using special prosecutors. You do not create change. Do not allow them to go for that in the PMR. Going on to the impacts. They say that this is an example of whiteness, but when we agree that the system is whiteness right now and that using the system is the only instance of whiteness, this is going to be a reason why it's not. You can extend across that this creates ontological suicide because we have zero intrinsic value to life and we have to be forced to go through the legal system, which is a corrupt system, and that's the only way that we can get value. Going on to the framework. Really just extend the fact that the K comes first, that our methodology is key. Their voting mechanism is a bad thing because they still say that this should be political effects, which is inherent of the system, which means that they're never going to be getting access to this.
Alright, so it's just going to be overview of the alternative that they make, going down through the same order that they go through, starting with that all the links that they make, arguments about the impacts, and then kind of an overview of the entire argument that they make through the framework, and then onto the offense coming out of the affirmative.
Okay. I'm ready when you are.
Okay. It was good?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Alright. The alternative is indistinguishable from the status quo. Black bodies have already rejected the system. That's our uniqueness argument from the very beginning. Mass incarceration and police killings have created a disillusioned racial undercastle. People are anti-legal system and anti-police, but that alone doesn't create any change. Protest movements will fizzle out if they can't point to any victories. That's our argument about the plan creating movement from the very beginning. On to the link arguments they make.
Point of order. The argument that movements are not not working, and the argument that movements are going to fizzle out without the plan was never made.
I said, from my flow on the case debate, plan creates momentum in the status quo. The system is perceived as monolithic and tractable, and that people can't change it. The plan changes.
I mean, I have insolvency out of the NG, like, plan is key to showing that there are victories.
Okay.
Okay.
436 remaining.
Cool. On the link arguments, we make no claims about agency coming from the state. We advocate and use any tactics against police violence in the state when we can prevent violence within it. We're not saying that police define what lives are. It's the perception that police don't care about lives that leads them to killing lives in the real world, and that's what we're trying to save with the plan.
You should extend the permutation.
extend the permutation. You can still do both. There's no reason why we can't. The net benefits that we advocate for are something they never address. We are saving lives, and that is something that Jack made an argument again and again about. We are saving lives while they are saving none. Even if it's just a life from one instance, or if it's hundreds of lives, we're at least making an attempt to save lives of police violence in the real world. The only argument they make is saying that we're still linking all over the place, but again, we're saying that the link that they're articulating comes from the idea that they misunderstood the argument from the beginning, that we're saying agency comes from the state. You shouldn't reject our argument just because we're trying to work within the system. I'll address the arguments they make about the system being bad overall.
On the permutation, we can engage with the system and realize that it's completely corrupt. The system already has legitimacy. We're not going to give it more.
We can engage within the system and recognize that it's corrupt. We're not going to give it more legitimacy. We're just going to interact with what it currently is. That's not reason to reject the perm. You still can extend the perm. We can do both.
Point of order.
Yeah.
Any extrapolation on how the perm solves is new.
I think specifically it's the legitimacy question
Yeah.
that is absent from the MG, and that an articulation about how the systems are illegitimate and thus we have to engage with it would be new.
Yeah.
Well, okay, one, I did a bunch of work on what the perm looks like in my speech, and two, the legitimacy argument was just answering like your link arguments. It wasn't like a net benefit. It was just like, doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with what Corey says, that I think that this articulation is new. But if what you're saying is you're not going for like it as like a new impact module to the permutation, then I suppose that that's not abusive.
I don't think it's a net benefit. It was just like, it's not, it's a reason why their perm fails arguments aren't true.
Alright, cool, you're at 320 remaining.
Cool. Next on the arguments they make in the impacts. They're trying to say that individuals can step out of the system, and the primary example they provide here is the Black Panthers. When the Black Panthers stepped outside the system, they were labeled as radicals, they were labeled as terrorists, they were ultimately labeled as the felons, and that's the problem. If they step out of the system in the way that they're saying with the Black Panthers, they're not going to gain any sort of legitimacy. They're just going to be labeled as felons and radicals and thugs who aren't actually going to bring any change. They're not addressing the idea that it is their whiteness saying they can step outside the system when it is impossible for the black body to step out of the system in the way that they can extend the arguments here that they're not really gaining any sort of unique impacts from that. Further, on the idea of the criticism as a whole, reject their blanket assertions of the system corrupting solvency. Many federal prosecutors have gotten indictments against killer cops. They make better the enemy of the perfect. They perpetually defer interacting within the system, which means police violence will forever continue if they make no attempt to solve it, while we actually make some attempts, so there's only going to be a risk that the affirmative can solve. Further, on the idea of the argument that we were calling protesters hippies. We're not calling Ferguson protesters hippies or any of the other protesters. We're identifying you as hippies. Ferguson protesters really want indictment. Negative is the paragon of whiteness by claiming that any interaction with the system to stop violence is bad. Guess what? This is non-unique. Black bodies are always caught inside the system, and their claim that the alt's deconstruction solve is white messiahism. If debate spills over to the real world, then our knowledge we provide of how to utilize tools to deal with state violence is good. Any defense of our methods means we can weigh our impacts. Going on to
The argument
Yeah,
in
go ahead.
response, in
sorry.
response to the like hippies link, the only argument from the MG is that the hippies thing was a joke. I think the construction in the PMR that we are hippies and it is a reason as to why you should reject our movement would be new.
I think it's a new rhetorical framing to call you hippies, but the argument that your alternative represents whiteness because it tries to step out of the system is not new.
Yeah.
Because I specifically say the idea that you can get out of the system is whiteness because black bodies cannot do that.
Yeah, I mean, if the argument that the PMR is going for is the one that you're saying, I agree that that was in the MG. I think if, under consideration, I suppose, 140.
I'm point of order too, sorry.
Sure.
The argument, the argument that they can weigh their impacts within our framework is new. They never responded to the K on the first framework.
It's not new at all. The top of the framework, my very first argument on the framework was that role-playing means that we have a good form of knowledge, which means that we can weigh our impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's under consideration pending how the rest of the PMR plays out.
Got it.
147 remaining.
Okay. Briefly going to the framework arguments that were just brought up, all the role-playing arguments that Jack makes were just addressed by them simply saying we can't interact within the system. They didn't really respond to the substantive arguments we were trying to make, specifically the third argument Jack made about how this methodology spills over. Extend that as being a main reason why you will vote on the affirmative, because when that methodology spills over, that's the only way to actually create true change with our role-playing.
Neither the plan nor the alternative happens. It's a question of which method is better. If we have arguments for why engaging institutions are better,
Mhm.
then the knowledge we give is something the judge can vote on.
Neither the plan nor the alternative actually happens. It's the method, and if our method is engaging the system to make it better, that is something you can vote on there. Okay, going on to the impacts out of the affirmative. They have not addressed any of the offense we generate that we are actually saving lives. This is the key argument that you're going to be voting on. Even if they were to gain access to all their impacts about ontological discussions, you have to see that saving lives is going to outweigh in that case, because saving these lives is something that can be real, can stop the police violence in a real way in the real world. Further, just some of the blibby arguments that they potentially have. They're saying that judges could fix. Again, they were ignoring the key idea that it's prosecutorial missteps and ultimately bias that is not allowing this to actually take place. The plan is creating this change and momentum within the system. All the arguments about how they would hide evidence, that doesn't make sense because the prosecutors would prosecute them for hiding the evidence and police misconduct. We are still solving for all the impacts coming out of the AC, which they never even put any ink on. Millions of,
Extend generally why special prosecutors solve.
Special prosecutors are not going to have any sort of biases. They aren't going to have to work with the police in the same way that prosecutors have to get evidence and testimony from them. There's going to be no bias. They simply make the assertion that the bias would still exist just because the system is bad. But we see that there are prosecutors who can do good, and in this case, the special prosecutors would.
Cool. Going. I'll tell you how I voted, a couple things, and feel free to ask questions, and we can talk as long as you guys want to or not want to. Ultimately, I vote negative for Nevada. I think that they are winning, that their method is better. I feel really weird about this debate, and I think that it's uncomfortably close in a couple of places because I think that both teams leave a lot of questions unresolved for me in the sort of the framework debate. This is a portion of the debate that a lot of times is invested in LOC. The MG puts a little bit of time here, but maybe not as much as probably should have. And then I feel like from the block on, there's very, very minimal discussion. And I think that creates some tension with the way that some of these arguments are functioning. Specifically, I think that the negative, certainly in the MO, is going very, very hard for a framing of this method question, that both teams seem to be spotting one another right, that only the method is important. It's only sort of a question of if the PMC method of talking about how we get from the state is good or not, right? I think that from the block on, really especially in the MO, not as much in the LOR, but it's still there, there's a hard framing of this debate as that it's a question of how we think about the state or how we think about how we interact with the state. That's really most of Corey's alternative solvency permutation answer arguments seem to be questions of there's this sort of external disad that only the alt avoids, which is like this value to life, ontological damnation argument about how we think of ourselves as individuals in relation to the state system first. I think that the affirmative is winning quite a few arguments that I think that your AF as such is good, right? I think that in the block on, they're largely unresponsive to the fact that something like the affirmative saves lives, right? I think that the missing argument here is when the negative goes very hard on this sort of, it's a question of how we think about what we do toward the state first. I think you'll have like a missing, I mean, make it maybe more simple than it really is, like a missing kind of consequentialism argument. They seem to be making arguments about why their sort of first step approach as such is good. And the PMR answers seem to be outcomes of our approach are good. Does that seem, how I understand at least, does that make sense what I'm trying to communicate?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel weird about it because I sort of agree that you're winning, that your AF as such is good. And I don't think the negative does a very good job with that portion of the debate. I should probably talk about the permutation stuff. I probably should have started there and I'm very sorry. On the permutation debate, I think that you probably needed a better articulation out of the MG of what the permutation sort of looks like. And maybe, like, especially on the question of, so like what does the permutation, I guess, even mean in the room? Or like what, right, because they're going really hard on the negative for these arguments. It's sort of like, well, when we think about approaching the state is important. And I'm left largely unresolved about what the affirmative is telling me our approach to the state should be. I think that I sort of, and so yeah, there's a pretty decent risk that you link to the criticism, even the permutation. I think that there's a pretty good argument you have going for you that I think you could develop a lot more and win this debate very easily, which is this sort of like, we have to engage within the state, like sort of incremental reformism, state power exists, so we ought to engage it. I think that you're debating a lot of those arguments from the standpoint of the way that if the act was or was not passed, and I would be very clear, I understand that your framing is very clear to me that you are not saying the act passes, right? So I don't understand that way. But I think you have that missing argument then about how having the debate as if it does, or having a debate about why that might be good even, right? Because that seems to be kind of how you're framing it. Like, we don't say fiat good, we say something like the AF maybe should exist, right? And so I think you have a missing internal link argument about then why that way of having this discussion is productive. That I think Nevada is just ahead on this question of sort of like, no, that even way of thinking about the system is bad. I think there's also sort of like a sequencing disadvantage to the permutation. Corey sinks a lot of time into this argument about why the alternative is sort of the first step, or sort of prior to the permutation offense, and I think that that's like kind of a sequencing argument for permutation as well. I think that like, honestly, I also feel though like the block was not super great. Like I think that you have some winning arguments, but certainly in MO, I think that you're sinking like, I mean, way too much time into the first like 2 sheets that you get to.
Yeah.
And then you end up really, really light on this framework debate, right? And that's where the debate gets really kind of confusing to me as far as at what level I'm supposed to be analyzing some of the claims from each side. I think especially too because I don't know that the MG is sinking quite enough time there relative to some other portions of the debate that probably should have been an area where you extrapolated more. I think also the LOR, maybe some tighter framing of sort of specifically, here's what voting AF for just PMC looks like, here's what voting negative for just a criticism looks like, here's what voting for just a permutation looks like, would have been helpful. And additionally, I think that's probably true of the PMR as well. I think that there's a couple of MG arguments, the MG arguments I'm referencing earlier, specifically about why reformism or state engagement is maybe a productive way to think about talking about policy, maybe try to link that up a little more offensively early in the debate with some of these framework areas would be helpful. I even think maybe the PMR should just started on framework, right? And been like, because you get there with like a minute, right? And I think that kind of takes away the chance to maybe try to do some deeper extension of some of those arguments. Like I said, I don't feel super good about, I don't feel super confident that these questions really get resolved in the debate very well. But that's how I voted, and I'm more than happy to answer questions or talk if anybody wants to.
Did you evaluate that there was a high risk of alt solvency, or if you didn't, did you evaluate the alt didn't really need to actually solve police violence?
So the alt solving police violence, is that the question you're asking?
Yeah.
So that's one thing I had to kind of figure out, because I think you are winning arguments that something like the affirmative is very likely to stop police violence, and that the alternative probably doesn't leave this room, right? That's sort of how I understand the debate at the end of the debate. That gets very confusing for me, because then on the framework debate, I think, that when it becomes a question of evaluating around method, right? I don't know how you can weigh that offense without a sort of argument about why having the debate about the topic, and if something like a plan is a good idea, right, is a way to materially, I mean, maybe not necessarily do something like the plan, right, but lead to better politics.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What did you think about the other alt solvency arguments that were just like, they're already anti-legal, anti-state movements now, but they're not effective?
Yeah,
that kind of
so
stuff.
there's like your CLS fails,
Sure.
and there's other things, people read books, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that potentially those could have been very compelling arguments. Coming out of the MG, I was kind of thinking, I kind of dig this, especially as somebody that studies CLS and thinks that they're kind of silly. Not silly, but largely ineffective. I think that the problem in terms of like that being a reason to vote affirmative, or at least how I viewed it at the end of the debate, was I think that the MO is doing a pretty good job of, I'm trying to look for the exact line of ink. I think that the way that the MO especially is framing this debate is pretty persuasive, at least in terms of how they aren't exactly CLS, they are a reconceptualization of how we think about engaging the state. And that's something that happens too, that I feel like the criticism in the block really shifts very hard from just a criticism of the system, right? Because there's sort of two floating link stories in the LOC, right? One is sort of system fucked, and the other one seems to be how we think about self to system or system to self. And they seem to be collapsing very hard in the MO to the latter. And I think that like you're probably winning some reasons why the alternative can't solve back to the former, but I think when they sink so much time into the latter, that's a problem. Okay. I don't know if that answered your question. If it didn't, you
no,
can try again.
That makes sense. Like where we would probably need to invest or be clear on the answers to the second part.
Yeah, and again, I think you're like I think maybe if the PMR is like more framework heavy, right? And if you're going to sort of, and for what it's worth, I think the notion of saying like we'll have a method debate, but our method's pretty good, right? Even with like a policy advantage Aff, I really think that that's actually a smart strategy, especially against criticisms like this, right? But I think that that sort of framing argument and then exactly how to evaluate the PMC in that framing argument need to be featured more heavily in the PMR.
For sure.
Because there's just not a lot there for me. So.
Is there anything I could have done differently in the LOC that would have?
I mean, I understood your arguments in LOC. I think that you're heavy in the link sheet and maybe getting a little bit redundant. I think that maybe going a little bit deeper into impact because you only sort of have this one, right? And I totally get that you have like these little tiny like embedded turns in the link arguments because that's kind of what's showing up all over the alt sheet in the MO, right? But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for doing it.
Thanks for luck, y'all.
Good luck with the rest of the tournament.
You too.
You too.